Hello to everyone, dear listeners to MARUF in 2021. We are very happy to be with you in our organization of MARUF 2021, and with the motto of cities providing solutions. We have the rethinking ourselves as we have a very special panel with you titled Pandemics and Cities, Is History a Futile Experiment? Our panelists are all international, so I will prefer to use English as the main language of the panel. I will also continue in English.
Welcome to our session. So under MARUF 2021, under the motto of Rethink Coact, we are together with you with a very contemporary topic, which is Pandemics and Cities, Is History a Futile Experiment? My name is Aslı Ceylan Öner. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Architecture at Izmir University of Economics in Turkey. And I will be the moderator of this panel. We have 4 distinguished scholars who are going to be joining us in this panel. Professor Ayyoob Sharifi, who is in the Graduate School of Humanities and Social Sciences in Hiroshima University in Japan. Professor Tim Soens, who is in the University of Antwerp in the Center for Urban History. Professor Keil, who is in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change in York University in Canada. And Klaus, who is a senior fellow in Chicago Council on Global Affairs in the United States. So I would like to give you a little bit of background about this session or the theme of this session. Well, we all know that urbanization has never been this rapid, yet it is prone to many crises like global warming, climate change, economic inequality, infrastructure, and affordable housing related issues. Well, on top of them, in 2020, we have seen another layer to these crises with the COVID-19 pandemic. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, we have experienced the largest quarantine in human history. So maybe this was one of the most important issues that made COVID-19 different from the previous pandemics and epidemics in history. Against this pandemic, the most important defense mechanism has been to provide social distancing by reducing the number of people using the city space and developing planning responses through well-maintained infrastructure of public transportation, road system, as well as hygiene and sanitation. All these acts and policies aim to create more resilient cities for the pandemic. So in this panel, titled Pandemics and Cities, Is History a Futile Experiment? We examine the changes that COVID-19 has brought on urban space, the lessons we learned from past pandemics, as well as the know-how we can transmit to the next generations related to pandemics and urban space. So with that, I would like to introduce our first panelist, who is in Japan. The time difference, it's getting very late in Japan, I believe. So I would like to introduce Professor Ayyoob Sharifi. As I said, he is in the Graduate School of Humanities and Social Sciences in Hiroshima University. Professor Sharifi's research is mainly at the interface of urbanism and climate change mitigation and adaptation. Ayyoob actively contributes to the global change research programs such as the Future Earth, and is currently serving as a lead author for the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Global Change, IPCC. We are very happy to have Professor Ayyoob Sharifi, and the title of his presentation will be Smart Cities and Resilience, Lessons from the COVID-19 Pandemic. So Professor Sharifi, the floor is yours.
Again, it's a great pleasure to be with all of you. And today I will talk about smart cities and resilience and some lessons that we can learn from smart city applications that have been used during the pandemic for future pandemics and to make cities more resilient. So Professor Ceylan gave us a very good background, and I just want to emphasize that one of the features, one of the distinct features of this pandemic was that it happened during a new era, which is characterized by increased connectivity driven by advances in information and communication technologies. And in fact, the COVID pandemic has provided additional momentum to smart city research, given the potential utility of smart city solutions for dealing with the crisis. So today, of course, smart city area is a very broad area, but I will specifically focus on the concept of resilience. And in terms of resilience, because there are many definitions for the term resilience, what I want to use as a framework for the discussions is emphasis on 4 different major abilities. One is planning and preparation, another is absorption, recovery, and also adaptation. So planning and preparation is something that usually happens before a disruptive event. Absorption happens in the immediate aftermath of the event. Recovery is something to get back to normal, and also adaptation, something which not only emphasizes bouncing back, but also bouncing forward and learning lessons from the pandemic. So what I am presenting today is basically a summary of a literature review of 147 papers that I have done with another colleague, Professor Garmsir, which is not attending today, unfortunately. So to start with planning and preparation, I want to emphasize that smart cities can contribute to resilience through mainly 3 different pathways. One is preparing and providing smart city infrastructure, which can allow us to better respond to pandemics. Another, facilitating collaborative and integrated planning and management. And also smart technologies can be used for forecasting and prediction, and also for identifying hotspots. So they have been used for these purposes. For instance, in terms of preparing and providing smart city infrastructure, what we saw in different countries is that preparatory activities and measures taken before the occurrence of the pandemic have affected the ability to respond and recover. For instance, some Southeast Asian countries or some East Asian countries that had experiences of previous epidemic events, they also had better abilities because they have developed some smart city infrastructure to respond to those events, and they kind of repurposed those technologies to also deal with this current event. For instance, also I can here highlight the issue of repurposing athletes' wearable devices for new purposes such as remote health monitoring and also modeling the spread of the virus, or repurposing urban control and command centers that are now common in many countries. For instance, they have been used in the UK or in India or in Brazil in order to better respond to the pandemic. In terms of facilitating collaborative and integrated planning and management, smart technologies can also be very useful in that regard. They can facilitate cooperation between different sectors for timely response or recovery, as shown in places such as China, Korea, and also Singapore. Also, smart technologies can be used for forecasting and prediction. Various IoT and AI-enabled technologies have contributed to data collection to identify potentially infected individuals. And analysis of this data has helped different local communities to respond to the pandemic in a more effective manner. So there is a lot of information in this slide, but I just want to highlight that in the paper that we published and I later introduced, we have provided details for different types of technologies and solutions and how they may contribute to dealing with the pandemic. For instance, here you can see that, again, urban control and command centers have contributed to better surveillance, to tracing and tracking, and also to real-time monitoring. In terms of absorption, again, this mainly focuses on activities that are taken place in the immediate aftermath of a disaster. And it can include preventative measures to control the spread of the virus, tracing and tracking of infected individuals, facilitating transparent communication, and preventing the spread of fake news. For instance, in terms of preventive measures, AI-based technologies have been developed that can detect positive cases based on body temperature and common respiratory symptoms, such as coughing and sneezing. And this have been used frequently in many parts of the world. In terms of tracing and tracking, contact tracing can be done using smart solutions that rely on a variety of spatiotemporal data collected from different sources such as mobile network providers, transportation cards, and so on. And they have also contributed a lot to dealing with the pandemic, especially in some countries like Korea, Singapore, and here in Japan as well. In terms of facilitating transparent communication, this is also very important because, for instance, machine learning techniques can be used to avoid the spread of misinformation, which is in fact the big threats nowadays. For recovery, smart cities also have proven very effective in terms of providing support to the overstretched staff and also providing alternative means to ensure continuity of basic functions. For instance, automated systems such as smart robots have been widely used to compensate for the shortage of medical staff by replacing humans, and also other technologies that have been used for this purpose. In terms of providing alternative means to ensure continuity of basic functions, this kind of solutions, for instance, have contributed to minimizing supply chain disruptions and facilitate better service delivery. There have been an increasing reliance on smart distribution and delivery systems to ensure fair access to vital goods and services, including food and medicine. And finally, for adaptation, which again, here the main point is that we should not only bounce back, but also bounce forward based on the lessons that we learned from the pandemic. And smart solutions have also been very helpful and effective in this regard. They have contributed to accelerating transition towards digitalization and also offering lessons to optimize city operations. For instance, the pandemic has brought to the fore some of the hidden or less known advantages of technical initiatives and has provided opportunities for real-world implementation of transformative smart city initiatives. Also, automation acceleration can be interpreted as an adaptation strategy adopted by many businesses around the world that has allowed them to deal with the crisis. In terms of offering lessons to optimize city operations, evidence shows that the cities equipped with 5G technology have been more successful in combating the pandemic through innovative solutions such as telemedicine, teleworking, and also smart surveillance. And these insights and experiences offer a strong reason for cities to increase their ICT infrastructure investment in the post-COVID period. And more smart cities are expected to shift towards 5G and even 6G deployment, since more effective adoption of smart city technologies require new generations of wireless technology. This was just a summary of what we have reported in this review papers. If you're interested, I would like to refer you to this paper. But here I just want to mention that in this presentation, I mainly highlighted the positive points, but this doesn't mean that there aren't trade-offs that we should be aware of. Of course, there have been concerns about digital divide, about some countries using technologies to further increase their authoritative power or to abuse the privacy of users. So, of course, there are always trade-offs, but it is believed that there are so many benefits as well. And if we can strengthen the co-benefits and benefits and minimize the trade-offs, the smart city solutions and technologies would be very helpful for dealing with pandemics in the future. So that brings me to the end of the presentation. I look forward to your questions and also discussions. Thanks. Back to you, Professor Ceylan.
Thank you, Professor Sharifi. Thank you for your speech. I know that you might need to leave early. So if that's the case, shall we, do you think we should have the discussion now, or will you be able to wait until the end of the panel?
I think I can wait. I was worried that I may be too sleepy because I had 3 classes today. So please apologies if I look a little sleepy.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you very much. Well, our next speaker is Professor Tim Soens from University of Antwerp Center for Urban History. Tim Soens is a professor of medieval and environmental history at the University of Antwerp, Belgium. His research mainly focuses on natural hazards and disasters in pre-1900 Europe, with particular emphasis on floods, pandemics, and famines. He's currently leading the EPIBEL, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, project on epidemics and inequality in the history of Belgium, as well as food from somewhere on urban households, access to land and alternative food entitlements in late medieval cities. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Soens, and his title of his speech will be Epidemic Inequalities in the City from the Plague to COVID-19. And the floor is yours, Tim.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Ceylan. A great honor to be part of this session. I hope you can hear me all. If that's okay.
We can hear you fine.
Okay, and you see my slide. We will indeed delve into history in my short presentation. In many respects, as we all have felt over the past years, cities are not the most pleasant environments to live in during a pandemic. Epidemic diseases spread through contact, and dense populations and dense interactions mean a lot of contacts. Confinement, lockdowns, isolate people at home, which is quite challenging in an urban environment usually. And hence, we see here on this picture from Venice, the relief in the city of Venice after the plague in the 17th century had gone, and the building of the Redentore Church in Venice, which materializes this relief after the plague. It's no wonder that people, it's no wonder that people have been thinking about relocating to the countryside temporarily or permanent during and after outbreaks of pandemics. During outbreaks of cholera in the 19th century, almost everyone who could afford it fled to his or her country estate, and so did centuries before the Florentine elite during the plague in the Middle Ages, which is immortalized by Giovanni Boccaccio in the Decamerone, you might know, where the people are telling stories and when they have fled from the city of Florence to the countryside. Are cities indeed lethal during pandemics? Historians and demographers know this problem as the idea of the urban penalty, the city as a sort of graveyard. The higher mortality rates in cities, both in normal years and during outbreaks of pandemics, are a well-known feature in urban demographic history. On this graph for Belgium, we see, for instance, mortality being highest in the old city of Namur in normal years and also during years of epidemic outbreaks in the 1866 cholera, 1870 with smallpox pandemics. However, was it really the city which was vulnerable to pandemics, or is it just some parts of the city? In a major city like Santiago de Chile, we see that both cases and deaths were much more important in districts with lower social economic status. These were also the districts which you can see on the graph below, where the impact of the lockdown and the impact of measures imposed by the government to restrict mobility were the lowest. So the urban penalty during pandemics might be in reality a sort of penalty of poverty. On the other hand, also for COVID-19, there are examples of cities where this is not the case. In Brussels, Belgium, you don't see this effect because some of the better off districts saw the highest mortality rates. And of course, much depends on the demographic profile of the district. A rich but old population might be equally or even more vulnerable than a poor but young population and a district with a poor but younger population. So what I want to emphasize in my presentation today is that the urban vulnerability to epidemic disease is to a large extent a social and political construct. It depends on actions, policies, strategies, some of them implemented in direct response to the pandemic, but others much more structural, situated in the way the urban economy and topography are organized. And to illustrate this, I will guide you through some of the epidemic hotspots in the urban history of Europe. And I will start in London during the plague of 1665. By the mid-17th century, London had a very clear social topography, which you see here on the left part of the screen, with a very rich city center and poorer districts at the edge of the city and also outside the city walls. And the excess mortality during the plague of 1665 shows virtually the opposite picture, which is on your right side. With the city center, the excess mortality is much lower than near the edges and the outskirts of the city. This is already known for 100 years. The plague has always been very much associated with poverty. As Guido Alfani recently summarized it, epidemics targeted poverty, they made it worse, and they only managed to reduce temporarily its extent when they proved lethal enough to kill large cohorts of the poor, because the survivors could negotiate better living and working conditions. So plague and poverty, plague, epidemics, pandemics, and poverty go hand in glove. On the other hand, this is not always the case. If we stay in London, but go back 100 years in time, we see on your right side, it's another plague episode, but now it's the city center which is most affected by the plague. So what is the pattern of the 17th century is not the pattern of the 16th century. That epidemics also hit wealthy populations and rich neighborhoods can also be illustrated in other case studies. I skip this one. This is Dijon in around 1400s. It will bring us where we see the research by Anne Galano in France has made clear that it was the richest neighborhoods which were mostly affected by the plague. And that's logic because it's in the rich city centers which were at that moment most densely populated and which had most contacts. So wealth and epidemic morbidity and mortality went together. How different was this in a 19th century city like Hamburg? At the height of its, we see here, Hamburg, late 19th century, is at the height of its pre-war expansion. And here, the cholera of 1892 shows a very clear spatial segregation, sparing the wealthier, slightly uphill neighborhoods in white here from the very hard affected working class neighborhoods in the old city center and in some industrialized suburbs. Cholera mortality in Hamburg in 1892 was easily six times higher if you earn 25,000 Reichstaler per year and more than if you earned less than 1,000 Reichstalers. So it was clear, very much the income gradient in cholera morbidity and mortality was enormous in Hamburg in the late 19th century. The mechanisms behind the social differences and vulnerability are very clear. Wealthy households, they never stopped to cook their water before consuming it. They had staff, maids, and footmen to protect themselves from the outside world, and if possible, they could leave the city until the pandemic had gone. And in the case of this cholera episode in Hamburg, we see the massive ticket sales at the railways from people who fled the city once it was known that the cholera was in the city. So what we observe here in Hamburg in 1892 is something we can label the toxicity of inequality. If we compare the odds of dying in the pandemic for the richest 10% of the population, which was 12.5 per thousand, and for the average population, 47 per thousand, then we can distinguish the level of mortality, which was probably inescapable in that period, and the largest part of the mortality, which was not inescapable at all. Because if you could protect as a society the richest 10% of that society from suffering from the pandemic, you could, in theory, also protect the rest of the population. This toxicity of inequality is a notion which allows us to figure out whether it was space or income which was more important in creating inequalities. In the case of Hamburg, the toxicity was higher for income inequality than for spatial inequality, meaning the differences between high and low incomes exceeded those between rich and poor neighborhoods. And that's important. Is the inequality and epidemic vulnerability mainly a feature of differences in wealth and income, or of differences in living conditions? If spatial inequalities were more important, then the problem was situated in living conditions. And the solution was a kind of sanitary revolution, improving housing and living conditions. But if income inequality was the main problem, then the solution was situated elsewhere. It was a problem of poverty, and the increase in living standards should be pursued. This also allows us to compare between cities and between epidemic outbreaks. Mortality, you should never compare mortality data directly as a demographic profile, and as well as the strength of the pandemic, the strength of the virus or the bacterial infection which caused the pandemic. It's always different from context to context, but you can compare this toxicity of inequality, which shows us here for a few major European cities during 19th century cholera outbreaks, that the toxicity of inequality was lower in Paris in 1832, higher in Hamburg, but especially higher in major Italian cities like Naples and Milan in 1836, 1884. How does it come? What explains now these differences between towns? Well, here it's policies which really make the difference. And to illustrate this, I want to take you briefly to a final example. It's a case study of a town in Sardinia, Italy, during a 16th century plague outbreak. It's a town of Alghero on the coast of Sardinia. What you see here in Alghero is a range of what we call today non-pharmaceutical interventions. So there is a plague outbreak, and a whole range of measures are imposed by the municipal authorities. And these measures imposed, these non-pharmaceutical interventions, they represent more or less the maximum program of non-pharmaceutical interventions available in the 16th century as well as today. If you see these measures taken in Alghero in the 16th century, they are exactly the same as we did today during the COVID-19 pandemics. All citizens are compelled not to leave their houses. when people have to go out for shopping, everyone must bear a cane 6 feet long, and it's mandatory that people keep this distance from one another. At the shops which are closed, stuff could only be sold at a parabenda, a large rail in front of the counters in the shop, in which meat, bread, wine, and foodstuffs are sold, so that citizens can keep distance from the counter itself. It's only takeaway which was allowed, you could say. And people have to maintain their distance from one another and from the seller, from the shopkeeper. Moreover, also important, if people should stay at home, they cannot work, they have no income, well, the city government must provide them with supplies and medicine, with food and medicine. We have examples from 16th century Italian towns where this is indeed the case. Mandatory confinement, lockdown at home means the city government has to distribute food. So this is very important. This means that this kind of lockdown situation, it existed already in the 16th century, but it was not implemented everywhere. You won't find this during 19th century cholera pandemics. You won't find this during plague outbreaks in many other parts of the world. It's a choice, it's a policy choice, which is implemented sometimes and not in other cases. When will municipal authorities, when will cities, when will societies impose this kind of measures? At a moment when they feel vulnerable. And they are the municipal authorities, the urban elites, which feel vulnerable, which feel that they could suffer from the impact of the epidemic disease themselves, their families, their relatives, their social environment. If not, they won't do it, because imposing this kind of measures is harmful for the economy, and there is a strong incentive at the moment that an urban elite is convinced that pandemics are poverty related and a problem of poverty, then the urgency to implement these harsh measures diminishes. They harm the economy and they cost a lot of money to feed people at home. So what this learns is that framing the epidemics as a problem of poverty is also a bit of a coping strategy. It's a coping strategy which allows not imposing harsh non-pharmaceutical interventions, which prioritizes the economy above the health of the population. And I will come to my conclusions back to Venice in the 17th century with some takeaway messages which might inspire further reflection. First, an observation. The virus is no leveler. The association epidemic inequalities and the association of epidemic disease with poverty are far from evident. It's far less universal than often thought. It happens in different degrees, and where it happens, it needs to be explained. This is all the more the case, and this is all the more important as high inequality, or the perception of high inequality, might be the reason pandemics persisted. And that's the threat. The association of epidemics with poverty is a coping strategy which allowed cities to escape from the pandemic, but also consolidated vulnerabilities. There is the risk today that the way out of COVID is increasing segregation, is increasing inequality in the experience of the pandemic. The reduction of the pandemic to a problem of poverty, which in itself consolidates also the pandemic and the vulnerability to the pandemic. Thirdly, there is a solution. High levels of inequality and epidemic vulnerability also prove that these pandemics in the end are societal features. They are not inevitable. It just like is the case with the debate on climate change, thinking that climate change or pandemics are inevitable is also an excuse not to act. And it's the same you see very clear in the history of pandemics, their impacts and the inequality of their impact is never inevitable. Governments, industries, households cannot just relax and do nothing, as they are doomed anyway. No, just like every degree matters, every victim to pandemic diseases also matter. So humans can make a difference and politics can make a difference, even in times of climate change, even in times of pandemic. These are a few thoughts from urban history I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. Very interesting. I'm sure we'll have many questions for the presenters so far. But before that, I would like to continue with other presentations, and we'll get back to these points during the time of our discussion. So our third presenter is Professor Roger Keil from the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University in Canada. Professor Keil is the author of Suburban Planet and co-editor with other scholars of the book After Suburbia and Massive Urbanization, Rebuilding the Global Periphery. Roger Keil's research areas are global suburbanization, cities and infectious diseases, regional governments, and urban political ecology. I would like to welcome Professor Keil, and the title of his presentation will be COVID-19 Network Disease on a Sub/Urban Planet. Professor Keil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ceylan, for the kind introduction and for the invitation. I will not be quite as historical as what we just heard, which was wonderful, but I will also take a little bit of a historical tack in my presentation today, and talk a bit about infectious disease in cities and how that relationship has developed, particularly in modern times. And the first thing to realize, which is that something that we have now all experienced, is that each epidemic or each pandemic is as big as the world we imagine it to be in. And here are a few examples. There is the Spanish flu on the left, which happened just after the First World War, which of course is called a world war and was experienced as such. And the pandemic that followed very much followed in that same world, and the imagination of that world was very much similar to the war theaters that had just happened. In the middle, you see one with a pandemic which we just heard about in the Middle Ages, the 14th century plague epidemic, and this is the world in which it happened. Of course, the region in which we assemble today, at least virtually, was right in the middle of that pandemic, with Istanbul and Turkish cities to be sort of way stations of the trip of the fleas and the pandemic that was caused to European ports, Western European ports. And then the SARS epidemic, which, as I'll also specify, in 2003, which connected some of the largest cities in the East, the rising emerging Eastern economies, particularly in China, but also elsewhere in East Asia, with cities like Toronto in Canada, where I speak from. And now, of course, we have experienced COVID-19 in an urban world. And of course, the world has not changed. The world is still the same world and still the same planet that we live on, but the perception and the construction of that world has changed over time. And it has changed again over the last few years. And the current pandemic is an expression of, to some degree, of those changes which I want to talk about. Cities, of course, have always been, which we just heard, been defined by their relationship with and response to the disease. And for most of human history, they were very vulnerable. The urban health penalty has been discussed. But it is important to understand that throughout most of human history, or most of history of settlement, the urban experience was a marginal one. I believe in 1800, about 2% of people in the world lived in cities. In 1900s, about 10%. So this urban experience, even though it attracted disease or produced disease, was an insular experience in a largely agrarian society around the world. But it all changed, of course, with the industrial era. During that time, hygiene, and the Hamburg example is a good one, becomes the main concern of overcrowded working class quarters. Typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis, and other infectious diseases posed a recurring problem, very rapidly recurring pandemics in the last decades of the 19th century in industrialized countries. The problem with this urban narrative that I'm sort of sketched here is that if it happens like this, it completely ignores some of the larger world historical events like colonialism, for example, and imperialism, which of course changed the dynamics besides the linear idea of urbanization and what that might have meant. So that's something we also need to consider in the current pandemic, which we will in a second. So at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, when we learned that we were now a majority urban species, people began to talk about the future of global health as urban health, which is quite different from somebody, lens of development studies in the middle to the end of the 20th century. So the focus now shifted from rural areas somewhat back to the city. And at the end of the 20th century, that changed in the context of how urbanization itself experienced shifts. So the majority of the new urbanization at the end of the 20th century began to take place in informal settings around the world, particularly in the global south, but in the global north also. It was the deindustrializing regions of the formerly rich industrial cores of the world. I remember Glasgow at one point being called the fourth world in that context, because the health conditions, particularly amongst men, were extremely bad in that period of deindustrialization. But until HIV/AIDS became the pandemic that it was and still is, the existing belief still took hold that infectious disease was something related to uneven development. It was something related to the global south, and the global north sort of had outlived that experience of infectious disease to some degree. In the 21st century, roughly, that changed. And here is a book I edited together with my colleague, Haris Ali, who I've been working most closely with over the last 15 years on these questions. In the 21st century, things changed in the sense that in the 90s, also influenced to some degree by American government policy, there was a global reevaluation of the perspective of what infectious disease means to both metropolitan countries and cities. And that came from the perceived threat of a global Ebola outbreak. And that was there was almost like a bit of a panic in the 1990s with a bunch of very important publications at the time. But also the 1997 Hong Kong bird flu event sort of sounded the alarm bells that something was happening that needed to be paid attention to. Then, of course, clearly SARS, the severe acute respiratory syndrome, which I already described in 2003, heightened the anxiety around those kinds of events, which was then replicated in rapid succession with the H1N1 threat in 2008 and 2009. But really, what put everybody on alert was the West African Ebola virus disease epidemic of 2014-15. And the reason why that was the case is because here something happened that people had feared earlier, which had never happened, is that a disease that was the disease of an isolated rural environment all of a sudden became a disease of major cities as it hit the capital cities of Monrovia in Liberia and Freetown in Sierra Leone particularly hard. About 10,000 people died during that epidemic. But of course, now in that we have this universal experience of COVID-19, we are well aware of how these predictions that were happening earlier in the century now became reality. So what has changed in that relationship of cities and disease? Now, of course, we all live in an urban society, and that's not just a quantitative thing that more than 50% of the world's population live in cities, but it's also that the type of urbanization has changed. We're not living in distinct towns that are sort of unconnected to one another, but we are in an urban environment more generally. Built social and natural environments are connected through urban lifestyle. So yes, we had the same things that happened in the plague outbreak when the Florentine elites left for the countryside. We had the same thing happen here too, because there were still places to escape to. But in a completely urbanized world, it's not that easy to find those islands in which the pandemic may not hit. So in urban society, when we talk about urban society, I use this now in with reference to the work of Henri Lefebvre, the complete urbanization of society. We have new types of social conflict and new types of politics arise that are different from individual cities, cases of outbreaks in particular cities. But now we have an urban society more generally that needs to be thought about. So we, Ceylan mentioned that I was a part of a project on global suburbanization over the last 10 years. And as part of that project, and somewhat as a reaction to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, we started working on this question of how these new forms of urbanization increase the likelihood of a disease outbreak globally. And we wrote this paper, which was just published about a month into the pandemic, one can say fortunately in a way for us, because we got some exposure for this, on extended urbanization and the specialities of infectious disease. And we looked at demographic change and infrastructures and governance in that context. And what we somewhat predicted, not that we're proud of, having predicted this, but we did think through that these questions of centrality, dispersion, density, urbanity would play a major role in any future disease outbreak. And that indeed was the case, but not necessarily in the way that it can be easily predicted, as we already heard in Tim's paper. It can be quite different in different places. So in the beginning, there was a lot of emphasis in early 2020 on these large urban centers, Wuhan, of course, where it all started, Milan, Madrid, London, Seattle, New York, Detroit, Montreal, all these places. But we also had an increased attention paid, of course, to the informal settlements that I spoke about earlier, where we now have the majority of urbanization happening in the peripheral areas of cities. We could see some differences here, and that's really a significant difference, because in the global north, now we can talk about this pandemic being a universal experience, but also being somewhat of a new experience, like a lockdown. And I remember during the SARS years, people were scandalized by the idea of a quarantine, both in Hong Kong or in Toronto. But now we were all in lockdown in the north, and we experienced that together. But in the global south, things are completely different, because there are multiple diseases happening all the time. People have infections of all sorts. Cholera is not in the past. Typhoid is not in the past. It's happening in these informal settlements, while something like COVID or Ebola is sitting on top of it. So the idea of a before and after, and the idea of an event, is seen completely differently in that context. So, but I can go quickly through this one. Now, none of those things are hypothetical anymore. Now it's experiential. We know what it feels like, what it is like in urban society to have this kind of experience, and we can react to it, and we can study the way in which we react to it, and perhaps learn something for the future, which I hope we will. One of the things that we started working on the basis of our initial interest in urban peripheralization, and that's why the sub/urban was important to us, with colleagues in Milan, for example, we looked at the city from the periphery. So we very strongly studied the outbreak in the Milan, North Italian area in the beginning of the pandemic and compared it to what was happening or still is happening to some degree in Toronto, the city where I live. And we repositioned the idea of COVID not at the center of the city where we had studied SARS, in the core regions of those global cities where SARS had been transmitted. But we thought about the social, spatial, and also the institutional periphery. So social and spatial, Tim has already spoken about the relationship here, and I don't need to perhaps go deeper into this. But the institutional periphery was particularly relevant in the COVID outbreak right from the start. And that refers to some degree, of course, to long-term care homes, but also to places like indigenous reserves here in Canada, but also places like migrant worker camps. Those are institutional peripheries that can be spatially peripheral, that can be socially peripheral in the sense of being areas of low income or spatial peripherality, but they're also institutionally different because those kinds of places, and I also count Amazon warehouses, for example, among them, they have a particular role in the global economy that was. So quickly to conclude, and I just realized that my internet is acting up, but I hope you can still hear me. So quickly after the pandemic, what another group of people that I've been part of have been arguing is that we need to see COVID-19 through an urban lens. And that gives us a number of advantages in looking at, and because it opens the perspective to the real extended forms of urbanization, the actual world in which the pandemic took place, and it sharpens the focus on the specific forced experimentation that was experienced in specific cities. So it's not always the same, neither in history as we've heard, but also currently in our crisis, it's not the same everywhere. And it values the role, very importantly, of citizens in urban communities in crisis response, which in the past wasn't always done because crisis response was given to those people who were thought of being professionally responsible, or the state. And it also reminds us of the fact in a globally urbanized world that the local state isn't just a local set of institutions, but it also, of course, connects to other scales of decision-making. So in the end, the post-pandemic city must live up to the demands of a substantive redistributive democracy and articulate many local experiences in a globalized world of cities where multi-scalar, multi-level connectivities define the parameters of urban politics. And the reopening of cities that we're now going through, we hope, has partly been a reconstruction of the status quo ante, which some of us don't like. We had hoped for more, but also partly it is a breakthrough to new modes of urban living. We've had this in the past with pandemics. Now, I just give you an example of the bicycle path has sort of become the symbol of that kind of breakthrough. So what I think in closing is that there are three types of responses visible right now: the direct public health responses. They're pretty clear, don't need to talk about them. Then there are opportunistic responses that are not directly related to public health, but are the consequences of spatial measures of pandemic response. That could be, for example, the cycling infrastructure I mentioned. And thirdly, there are these unforeseen and unintended consequences that include societal power shifts, democratization on the one hand, but also perhaps more authoritarian state responses. So we need to watch for that. And that can be a long-term set of changes that could be creeping changes that we don't see right away, but how do we deal with poverty, to use that example again, is not just a momentary thing, but we need to think about creating, long-term responses to vulnerability in that sense. And there was a good article in this week's The Atlantic by Ed Young, who makes these arguments for the American case, but I think we can all learn from it, is that now, of course, the pandemic response has shifted to preparation already. Now we need to think ahead that we are now moving into a period where pandemic response is pandemic preparation. We have to learn that as these medical measures are never enough, vaccines won't be enough. In many countries, the vaccination rates have plateaued. Essential workers are still essential and are still vulnerable. And the inequalities that have been highlighted in this pandemic of racial, class, gender, and other spatial inequalities, they must be addressed head-on, locally and globally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roger. Very interesting, especially your book, Network Disease. I mean, as soon as I started to think about this pandemic and how it's going to shape the cities, that was the first resource that I've consulted. So it was very, very valuable. Thank you for that. And followed by the article that you have shown. Thank you. So our last speaker is Klaus, who's a senior fellow in Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Previously, Klaus was senior advisor for global cities at the US Department of State, deputy United States negotiator for the United Nations Conference on Housing and Sustainable Development, Habitat 3, and Ernest May Fellow for History and Security Studies at the Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's joining us from the US, from Chicago, I believe. I would like to welcome Klaus, and the title of his presentation is The Pandemic and Cities, Continuities and Disruptions. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Ceylan. Very nice to see you again. And thank you to the Marmara Urban Forum team for the invitation. And good morning. I'm in fact not in Chicago, I'm in San Francisco. So instead of slides, I think you're going to get the sun coming up behind me.
So it's very early there. Thank you for joining us.
It's quite early, but it's very late for Ayyoob.
Yes, very late for Ayyoob, very early for you.
Indeed. But it's really, really wonderful to be here this morning, and what a tremendous set of talks to have to follow. In fact, I'm going to try to be briefer than I was planning on being, because I think so many would benefit from conversation and questions. I would say at the outset that I think that the question of the futility of history has probably been answered by the last 3 papers, the last 2 in particular, with historical focus, because they add such knowledge and depth, but policy relevant knowledge as well. And I think that Roger buried it there a little bit, but for anyone watching, I mean, that definition of the post-pandemic city, incredibly efficient, economical, and useful, was just fantastic, as the balance of status quo ante and some of the disruptions, which I think we're here to talk about tonight, this morning. The wreckage, I mean, human, economic, social, and political, is of course all around. We've seen over the past 18 months, the OECD, the IMF, the World Bank, G7, G20 issue findings on the setbacks to the global economy and to global health that have resulted from the pandemic. And I think the SDGs provide perhaps easiest and most capturable perspective. The pandemic has made delivering on, at a minimum, SDGs 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10, 16, and 17. You can go online to see what exactly those are. There are only 17, so it's a good portion of them. Much, much more difficult to deliver upon. Armo Revi at the IHS and UN Chronicle recently, and Robin Nadeau and Brendan Fisher of the World Wildlife Fund and the journal Nature have made convincing arguments, I think, around the SDG setbacks that have occurred as a result of COVID-19. So here I'd like to do ever so briefly a piece of advertising, in part because it's relevant to our question today, and in part because it's not for my own work, so it's not embarrassing. 2 weeks ago, the Chicago Council released a collection of essays encouraging us, taking up the mention of Henri Lefebvre earlier, to reconsider the rights of the city in the context of COVID and other recent changes. There are essays in China, Latin America, and Africa, and great scholars and practitioners like Andrew Tucker of the African Center for Cities, Leslie Kern of Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, and Raquel Ronick in Sao Paulo all offered contributions. Many of these essays in the collection speak eloquently and persuasively to disruption. So this morning, I'm going to quickly do the opposite and explore two continuities from the pre-pandemic period. The first of historically informed local action from below, some of which was referenced in Roger's talk near the end with Michaela Couto footnoted. And the second of transnational cooperation among local actors horizontally. Within 3 days of each other, in mid-March, the state of California, the self-governing region of Catalonia, Spain, and South Africa all entered quarantine. South Africa is more than 10,000 miles from Cape Town, and Cape Town more than 11,000 miles by land from Barcelona. And yet similar approaches were adopted across these great distances and by multiple levels or scales of government. To me, this was an amazing historical moment. With political will, blunt policy, 4 centuries old, that's how blunt it was, as Tim just showed us, can spread as fast as a baffling pandemic. But alongside these macro global histories, we will have micro histories of local urban adaptations and interventions. Consider the number of social distancing indicators we all have encountered, or the myriad ways our streets were remarked or reclaimed. Cars retreated, cars sped up, skateboarders triumphed, skateboarders were thwarted. The practices were often developed in an ad hoc fashion and were shared informally across subcultures and social media, rather than between governments. In fact, such practices frequently involve the use of public spaces governments retreated from or eased regulation and enforcement, or in certain instances, quickly got created themselves. For me, one of the curiosities of COVID-19 is the degree to which the reach of government and policy appeared to stretch further into daily life than ever before. And yet city residents refashioned the city around them through minor interventions sometimes, as if there was no government at all. In April and May, the Barcelona Center for International Affairs released an illuminating series of case studies on urban responses to COVID-19. These are early days still, so far as history is concerned, yet the pieces allowed provincial knowledge sharing and debate. A number of notable points stand out across the studies. To be sure, the responses of national governments were essential. But read as a collection, the CEDAW reports speak as much to the importance of civil society and resilience and preparedness as to that of national governments. In Barcelona, as Hannah Abdullah has detailed, the Barcelona City Council partnered with neighborhood maker organizations to produce PPP. Neither the organizations nor the relationships were initiated in response to COVID-19. Rather, the two groups were, quote, able to partner up so rapidly and successfully because they could build on pre-existing cooperative relations. Susan Parnell and Clara Mazzetti-Klassen have shown how multi-level crisis governments by the Western Cape province and the city of Cape Town was supplemented by extensive activity from civil society organizations dating back to anti-apartheid efforts. Andrea Tobias-Zevi has shown how amid challenges of multi-level governance, long-standing institutions such as the Catholic Church and leading philanthropies filled crucial gaps, particularly as it came to vulnerable groups. The macro history of COVID-19 is not going to be generous to national and international leaders and policymakers. Given the loss of life, particularly among vulnerable minority populations, we needn't go naively searching for success stories. Coherent national and international responses were and still are needed. Like most historical analogies, I think that of Dunkirk is overused and often wrongly deployed. But in reading the micro histories of these local organizations around the world that, in the face of massive strategic blunders, showed flexibility, dedication, and resilience, one can envision a flotilla of small boats crossing treacherous pandemic waters. Not to be lost in the policy history of COVID is how many of those decentralized systems relied upon long existing, running in parallel civil society organizations. In March 2020, most cities and most civil society organizations had not recently experienced a pandemic, particularly in the global north, obviously. The early histories of Barcelona, Cape Town, and Milan, to name but a few, speak to the importance of long-standing civil society organizations to addressing their traditional areas of focus, from social justice to faith and community, to technological innovation, but also in providing resilience against surprises. From below, or civil society organizations, to transnational collaboration. Ayyoob has talked about the networks that inform smart cities, and Roger referenced network disease. He also, as I mentioned at the outset, flagged the work of Michela Acuto, who's done a great deal of work on the rise of city networks. These city networks, of course, encourage the sharing of policy, information, knowledge, the building of community across countries, across continents, across seas. Over the past 2 decades, mayors and city governments have risen in influence on the global stage, I would argue. Urban perspectives are now commonplace at major multilateral meetings and international negotiations. The organization of disparate cities from different states and continents into a collective voice around pressing policy challenges is, in and of itself, a diplomatic accomplishment that predated the pandemic. Relationships between cities, particularly through networks, have strengthened over the past decade, 2 decades, and this improves the quality and extent of city diplomacy. As a little sub-dive into how this has shifted, let's look at the US government's conception of the role of cities in diplomacy. The US State Department and the Department of Defense issue quadrennial reviews with sweeping analysis and policy prescriptions meant to guide years of activity. These reports are laboriously prepared and heavily litigated. In the State Department's first review from 2010, urbanization was briefly identified as a potential contributor to conflict. Cities mattered because of their status as population centers, not because of their policy capacities or collective global influence. By 2015, the US framework had started to shift. The 2015 QDDR identified cities more explicitly as policy actors and innovators in their own right. While still calling attention to global demographic changes, the report emphasized climate change as the illustrative policy area rather than subnational stability and violence. Eyeing the ongoing Paris Agreement negotiations at the time, it explicitly identified city halls as sources of potential policy innovation. Public-facing documents from the US intelligence community, I know that's not what anyone was expecting to talk about this morning, have followed a similar trajectory to that of these reports. The National Intelligence Council issues a benchmark foresight report used by everyone in the US government called Global Trends every 5 years, all US agencies anyways. The 2012 assessment called Global Trends 2030 Alternative Worlds identified urbanization as one of the underlying forces behind megatrends in demography and the diffusion of power. The 2021 report just issued, meanwhile, moves well beyond demographics, offering a robust engagement with the ecosystem of city diplomacy. This, I think, is quite a remarkable conclusion to come from a national government, and I quote, "Local and city governments, increasingly organized into networks, will take action on international issues such as climate change and migration, getting ahead of national governments in some cases." This move from viewing cities as arenas to cities as actors is an important analytical jump, and one that follows the dramatic expansion of transnational city networks and philanthropic support for city-based climate action. So I ask whether or not the collaboration across city networks has been disrupted or in fact advanced and strengthened in the face of the pandemic. There are 300 roughly city networks in the world, that number up from 200 about 5 years ago. About half of them are transnational in nature. We've seen organizations like C40, Cities Network, and Metropolis pivot very quickly to the pandemic and a focus on it. Similarly, the U20 and other platforms that lobby multilateral platforms have been able to move very quickly into the pandemic policy space, as it were. So one of the I think continuities of the city space is that from the past 20 years, we've seen a building up of cities as actors on the global stage in collaboration by cities. At the moment the pandemic hit, the networks that inform that and the philanthropies that support it were able to pivot very quickly to focusing on the pandemic and encouraging policy collaboration and exchange across borders. So as it comes to global governance, as well as local civil society, I think there's some continuities as well as massive disruptions that are worth exploring and that will continue to be worth exploring over the next couple of years as we work our way through this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ian. Thank you to everybody. So now I would like to remind our viewers if they have any questions to post their questions to the chat panel. But while we are waiting for them, I would like to, abuse my position as the moderator and maybe start asking you some questions. Let's see where we can start from. Tim, maybe I should start from you because this, your presentation has been very important to frame what has happened in the world and what was the process and what are we doing now, with COVID-19 pandemic. And you have looked at this comparison between the people who are affected and their income level and their spatial quality. And sometimes it was about, where there is density, regardless of the income, the epidemic spread quickly. But mostly, if I'm right, throughout the history, the density in most cases is associated with economic or poverty, let's put it that way. So there are a lot of things to be explored there. But one thing that I was thinking about while listening to your presentation is that in terms of COVID-19, I'm sure those kind of inequalities still persist. But I have this example of Sweden in mind. Sweden dealt with COVID-19 pandemic in a very different way. They didn't have that penalty, like the urban penalty issue. They dealt with it in a very open way, and they left it to the citizens. So do you think by considering Sweden as an example, have they learned from history? Why did they go through that route?
Thank you, Ceylan. That's a very interesting question. Has Sweden better learned than other countries from history? Sweden, of course, has a different urbanization to start with. It's not, apart from a few cities, the country is not very densely populated. But what is interesting, I'm mainly triggered by this connection indeed between the pandemic and poverty. And how you see that that it's very difficult for, and I think this is the same kind. I don't have the data at hand, but I would be very interested if the Swedish experience is different in the way with regard to the inequalities in the direct mortality from the pandemic, but also in the indirect impact of the pandemic and the impact on income losses, etc.
Do you think they dealt with the pandemic differently?
They had a different discourse. So indeed, it's a different, I'm too close to the camera. It's the discourse is different, and the relation between state and population probably was also different. That's true. But it's not. I would be interesting to see, and I don't know at this moment, what you see in many European towns, and which is quite historical, is that they are losing grip on part of the most vulnerable populations. For instance, the difficulty of convincing people to take the vaccine, which is very socially biased. I don't know if this is different in Sweden, and I don't think it's really different. I don't think there as well that you will see that in the bigger cities, the vaccine uptake, for instance, will be lower in Sweden as well. And within the bigger cities like Stockholm, that it's also, again, lower in the most vulnerable neighborhoods. So I think in the end, the difference is more discursive than it's in practice.
Okay, thank you.
It's interesting.
I would be also happy to, if there are any studies, I would be also happy to follow them because I'm also curious. Thank you. Well, I don't know, I asked the moderators if there are any questions to write them to me, but let me go to my second question. And
since you're waiting, could I say something about that?
Of course, please do.
It's really interesting. And I think it's really hard to say yet what is the full outcome, but living in a large country, not in a small country, Canada and Sweden in many ways are often compared. Sweden is the go-to place for Canadians to compare themselves with. So there, is an interest in Sweden as a social democratic country with certain ideas about freedom and but also social safety nets. And Canada thinks of itself in much the same way. Particularly, we think of ourselves different from the United States in that context, or even from the UK. And so there is an interest here. But what I would like to say is that in a large country like Canada, I've learned that there is a Sweden in every country, right? We have provinces in Canada that are more like Sweden, and provinces that are more like other examples that have taken measures. And I liked Ian's reference to, how cities exchange information. Also, subnational governments generally and national governments exchange information. So the Swedish temptation was there in all countries in the world for a while. But at the other end, people looked at places like New Zealand and Vietnam. And I think it's important to say that there was a mixing and matching in some jurisdictions of those kinds of things. I also think it's really important to understand the interchange between government action and, as Tim already pointed out, vaccine hesitancy, for example, or COVID skeptics, who were the ones, while everybody else stayed at home, all of a sudden went to the public spaces and public places to show their political force and put governments under pressure to say, we want to be more like Sweden, we want to open up. So it is an interesting political question of political exchange and process that we still have to study. So I think it's very difficult right now in October 2021 to come to a final conclusion on what worked and what didn't work and what Sweden could symbolize for us. And that is true not only for countries, but also, since our topic is today cities, that's of course also true for cities. What worked in Vancouver, Montreal, or Toronto, the three large Canadian cities, was quite different.
Thank you. I like that phrase, there's a Sweden in, like every country. That was nice. My next question will be to Roger. And Ian might also be interested in the question as well. What I was thinking is like we are talking about globalization. We were talking about globalization. And after this pandemic, globalization was mostly associated with the flow of people, flow of goods, and everything. And after this COVID-19, we have started to see that flow of people really, really was minimized, especially the tourists. And also countries started to hold off to their especially health products because they needed that. So the outlook was like there's some kind of disruption to global flows of materials and people. But on the other hand, what we see is like, yes, everybody was working from their homes and if you would, I mean, tell me if you agree with me or not, but the flow of ideas, flow of information exchange accelerated at a higher speed. It was very, very fast. So at this point, yeah, we are, the vaccination is still an issue. It's something that people are considering. There are some anti-vaccination, like protests maybe, but many people got vaccinated. So some people are trying to go back to their offices, trying to normalize. But it seems like this hybrid style of working will be with us for a long time. And actually, it might be more efficient in some cases for the employers, for certain industries. So that was a question in my mind for a long time. So has globalization really been disrupted because of this pandemic? Or have we switched to a different form of globalization, which we can name as digital globalization, which has different aspects, maybe which is faster, maybe which is kind of more efficient in certain ways, that is going to kind of serve the global economy in certain sectors or not? This was my question that I had in mind. So Roger, would you like to comment on that?
I can, but I think that my co-panelists also all have to say something about this, so I'll be brief. I think that, again, it's very difficult to say right now to parse out what is pandemic related and what is not. I would agree with you that the digital globalization has afforded us with opportunities like the one we are now partaking in, which is I can talk to people on 3 continents at the same time, which is fantastic, and we're all used to this. And in my line of work, and what most of us do here on this panel, in teaching, this has given me opportunities, and I'm still teaching online at home and remotely. I got used to some of those things. I miss a lot of things about in-person teaching, but I also now understand that I can ask people in faraway places to come to my class, and they won't say no, because they're used to the idea that I'll ask them and I'll do the same for them. And so those kinds of opportunities clearly arise. But I think what we need to be careful is to come to too early conclusions about what it means for globalization. I'd like to see whether the auto industry in Wuhan has picked up fully and how that relates to political change in the relationships between Germany and China, because it's the German auto industry that is in Wuhan to a large degree. So those questions need to be looked at empirically. We also need to think about, whether we continue to see container ships stuck in the Suez Canal. Does that have anything to do with the pandemic? I don't think so. And I don't think the Brexit-related petrol shortages in the UK have anything to do in terms of supply chain management with the pandemic. It has to do with Brexit and with that particular government's decisions. And I hope I don't offend anyone in Britain by saying that. But those things have to be dissociated from one another, and we have to look at them in detail. And that is also, again, true in every city. We have to look at how that worked. Not all Amazon warehouses were affected by the pandemic, but significantly amounts of Amazon warehouses were infected, and that created supply chain issues. And of course, questioned, just as Amazon, this kind of economy, I use Amazon as an example, exploded to become the major way of how we get things as we were in lockdown. It also immediately shone a spotlight of vulnerability on this economy. And we need to look clearly now at each warehouse, at each country's conditions of minimum wage work and all that, to see what works and what doesn't, and where do we need the improvements, and what does that mean for globalized economies, globalized urban economies, globalized suburban economies in the near future.
Okay, thank you. Ian, would you like to comment on that as well?
Sure, and I think Ayyoob could probably take up the question of where we're going to be working from in digital connectivity. I share Roger's observation that it's been great to collaborate during this period. I mean, one of the funny things, of course, is when you invite people now, you used to deal with sort of, are they vegetarians or do they eat meat, and what sort of status do they get on an airplane? And now you have the sort of Zoom questions, like, does it have to be prepared, and will I have slides? And we've all become Zoom divas. Just really quickly on the question of globalization, I mean, I will say that there's not enough time to explore this, and when I hit 7:27, I'm going to stop talking no matter what, because I know at 7:30 it's turning us off. The globalized city, so to speak, of the late 20th century was not an intentional affair. It was product of a certain political and economic order that was being orchestrated through Washington without any eye towards producing urban form. And one of the interesting things that, Roger just detailed a couple of events, national political and geopolitical ones that don't seem to be immediately pandemic related. But the ongoing tensions and geopolitical dance between the US and China is one that has not been undone or solved or necessarily gotten tremendously worse because of the pandemic. Those tensions, and in fact, the rise of China and the BRI more generally, will have an influence on urban form in the same way that American hegemony in the late 20th and early 21st century did. And so I suspect that one of the things we're going to be seeing is a globalization, but in different forms that influences urban form. 7:27.
Thank you. My last question, Ian. Have we lost you? Okay. Yes, he's here. We lost you for a while. Thank you, Ian. We don't have much time, so my last question is for Ayyoob. Ayyoob, you talked about the digital divide, and yes, we all know that we have concerns about the digital divide, and for smart cities, we have to overcome that. But are you optimistic that the world can get over this digital divide?
So, sorry, I lost your voice for the last 2 seconds. Could you just repeat that?
Are you optimistic that the world can get over this digital divide, or will this smart cities, smart systems, will they define a new kind of inequality?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question, actually. And I'm quite optimistic because I think at least as I mentioned, this pandemic has accelerated digital transition. And this means, in my opinion, that many countries will continue investing on this front. And gradually, this may decrease digital divide. So it depends on how we see digital divide. But if it's in terms of access to digital technologies, I think that this is something that will become better in the future. And it is actually getting better and better now. Even in small communities, we can see that people have access to even smartphones. But if it's like more complicated digital technologies, it might be more problematic. So some developing countries may not have the same level of access. So this probably requires some international cooperation in terms of also contributing to SDG 17, if I am correct. And this would be really necessary to deal with digital divide, because digital divide, I think, has a lot of dimensions. And especially if it, in terms of better governance, more efficient infrastructure systems, that could also provide co-benefits for climate change adaptation and mitigation, that would be something very challenging, because a lot of countries are still way behind of the global trends, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, we are right on time. We have used our time very, very well. I thank all of you for your participation to Marmara Urban Forum. I'm sure the viewers have benefited a lot from the discussion. I know I have. And I really thank each and every one of you for your time, for sharing your knowledge with us. And with that, I think we're ready to close our panel. Thank you again, and see you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.